There's a photograph from early 2001 that people can't stop looking at. In it, a 4-year-old girl smiles at the camera, her hair styled carefully, her dark eyes bright. Her name was Rilya Shenise Wilson. The acronym stood for something her mother had chosen. Remember, I love you always. By the time anyone printed that photograph on missing person flyers, Rilya Wilson had already been gone for 15 months. No one had noticed. Not the state agency charged with protecting her, not the caseworker supposedly visiting her every month, not the foster care system designed to keep children safe. For more than a year, a 4-year-old child simply vanished from existence, and the people paid to watch over her kept filing paperwork saying everything was fine. The question isn't just what happened to Rilya Wilson. The question is how a child can disappear in plain sight, while an entire government bureaucracy pretends to see her. How does a little girl become so invisible that her absence makes no sound? This is a story about systemic failure so complete, it changed laws across the country. But more than that, it's about a child who needed protection and received none. A child whose name meant love, but whose life was marked by neglect so profound that even her disappearance went unnoticed. And 24 years later, Rilya Wilson has still never been found. Rilya Shenise Wilson was born on September 29, 1996, at a Miami hospital. Her mother, Gloria Wilson, was 2 years old, homeless, and deep in the grip of crack cocaine addiction. There would be no joyful homecoming from the hospital, no carefully prepared nursery. Gloria was living on the streets, moving between abandoned buildings and the temporary mercy of friends who would let her crash for a night or two. The name Rilya was Gloria's attempt at something permanent, something that would survive her own chaos. Remember, I love you always. It was both a promise and an apology, the kind of thing you say when you know you won't be there. And Gloria wasn't there. She couldn't be. The cocaine owned her completely, and motherhood was just another thing happening to her, not something she was equipped to handle. Rilya wasn't Gloria's first child, and she wouldn't be her last. There was an older sister, and there would be a younger one, Roderica, born not long after Rilya. All of them would end up in the system, because that's what happens when your mother is homeless and addicted and unable to feed herself, let alone 3 small children. When Rilya was just 5 weeks old, the Florida Department of Children and Families took her away. The reports documented what everyone could see: neglect, unsafe living conditions, a mother whose drug use made her incapable of basic child care. Gloria's parental rights were terminated shortly after. The state became Rilya's parent. This was supposed to be the moment when Rilya's life got better, when the system stepped in to save her. But the system that took custody of Rilya Wilson was already broken, and the cracks were about to swallow her whole. The first placement was with a woman named Pamela Kendrick, who was Manville Cash's aunt. Cash claimed to be Rilya's father, though he never took a paternity test to prove it. He was in and out of jail for auto theft and drug charges. Another ghost figure in Rilya's life who appeared in paperwork but not in any meaningful way. According to later testimony, Rilya was happy with Kendrick at first. She was fed, clothed, taken care of. For a brief window there was stability. But Kendrick had her own problems. By late 2000, allegations of neglect surfaced, and DCF removed Rilya from Kendrick's care. This is where the story takes its fatal turn. Enter Geraldine Graham, a woman in her 50s, who would become the central figure in Rilya's disappearance. Graham had connections to the case through a complicated web of relationships that nobody could quite untangle. She claimed to be Rilya's paternal grandmother, though this was disputed. Gloria Wilson insisted Graham was not related to them at all. Graham also claimed to be Rilya's godmother. Others said Gloria had met one of Graham's daughters in a drug rehabilitation center, and that's how the connection formed. The truth was murky. What's certain is that Graham convinced a retired DCF supervisor named Willie Harris to move Rilya from Kendrick's home to hers. The rationale was that Rilya's younger sister, Roderica, was already in Graham's care, and it would be better for the siblings to be together. Harris agreed, even though Graham was operating as an unlicensed foster caregiver. The arrangement was informal, a handshake deal facilitated by someone who no longer worked for DCF but still had influence. Graham lived with her partner, Pamela Graham, in a modest house in Miami. The two women were not related, despite sharing a last name, and despite sometimes claiming to be sisters. Geraldine was a complicated figure, with a long history that DCF somehow failed to uncover. She had used 47 different aliases over the years. She had been diagnosed with a psychotic syndrome similar to schizophrenia, Just months before taking custody of Rilya, she had been sued by 12 creditors and named in 7 landlord-tenant disputes. When she was eventually arrested, police found her carrying 10 different driver's licenses. But in 2000, none of this showed up in her background check. DCF approved her as a caregiver and handed over a 4-year-old child. The caseworker assigned to monitor Rilya was Deborah Muskelly, a woman with more than 100 children on her caseload. 100 children. Think about that number. One person, responsible for checking on, documenting, and ensuring the safety of 100 vulnerable kids. It was impossible, and everyone knew it. Muskelly would later testify that she often used the telephone instead of in-person visits because she simply couldn't keep up. She would call Graham, ask if everything was okay, and Graham would say yes. Fine. Great. The child is doing well. And Muskelly would file paperwork stating she had conducted an in-person visit when she hadn't. She falsified records for months. She claimed travel reimbursement for visits she never made. She submitted reports to judges saying Rilya was safe and thriving when she hadn't laid eyes on the child. When asked directly in court if she had visited the home after January 2001, Muskelly answered flatly, "I didn't go. To understand what happened next, you have to understand Miami in 2000. This was a city still dealing with the aftershocks of the cocaine wars of the 80s and 90s, a place where poverty and wealth existed side by side in jarring contrast. Liberty City, Overtown, Little Haiti, these neighborhoods carried the weight of decades of disinvestment and neglect. Children in poverty were everywhere, and the agencies meant to help them were drowning. DCF was a disaster. Caseworkers were overworked and underpaid. Files went missing. Kids fell through cracks so wide you could lose entire families in them. Foster care was a revolving door of placements, and children moved from home to home with alarming frequency, their records trailing behind them like debris. There was no functional oversight. Supervisors signed off on paperwork without verifying anything. Judges trusted the reports filed by caseworkers, assuming they were accurate. The system operated on the honor system, and when honor collapsed, nothing caught the fall. This was the world Rilya Wilson lived in. A world where a caseworker could stop checking on a child for 15 months and no one would notice. A world where a little girl could vanish, and the machinery meant to protect her would keep grinding forward as if she were still there. In late 2000, witnesses would later report seeing signs that something was wrong in the Graham household. A woman named Detra Coakley Winfield testified that she loaned Graham and Pamela a dog cage to keep Rilya safe. She said Graham complained about the child's behavior, said Rilya was difficult, troubled, acting out. Winfield never saw Rilya inside the cage, but she remembered something else. She didn't see Rilya at all after Christmas 2000. That timing is critical. Christmas 2000. Witnesses placed Rilya alive at the Graham home through the end of December, but after the holidays, sightings became sporadic, inconsistent. And then they stopped. Around this same time, Graham began making phone calls to DCF. She told caseworkers that Rilya was exhibiting bizarre behavior. She said the child needed psychological evaluation. She claimed Rilya was mentally troubled, plagued by problems that made her difficult to manage. These calls created a paper trail, a narrative Graham was building. In early January 2001, Deborah Muskelly made what would be the last documented welfare check at the Graham residence. She saw Rilya, or at least she later said she did. She described the child as quiet but clean. She saw nothing concerning, nothing that warranted further investigation, and then she left. That was the last time anyone from DCF confirmed seeing Rilya Wilson alive. On January 18, 2001, something happened. We don't know what, exactly. There are no witnesses to the moment itself. But January 18, 2001, is the date Graham would later cite as the day Rilya disappeared. According to Graham's story, the one she told to investigators in 2002, an African-American woman arrived at her home on that day. The woman was professional-looking, well-dressed, carrying official identification. She claimed to work for the Florida Department of Children and Families. She said she was there to take Rilya for a psychological evaluation, the kind of assessment Graham had been requesting. She knew details about Rilya's case, personal information that wouldn't be available to just anyone. She spoke with an accent that Graham thought might be African in origin. Graham said she handed Rilya over to this woman. The woman left with the child, promising to return her after the evaluation. And Rilya was never seen again. Graham claimed she tried calling DCF to check on Rilya. She said she spoke with Deborah Muskelly, told her what had happened, and Muskelly assured her everything was fine. The child was being evaluated. She'd be back soon. Graham said she accepted this explanation, even as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and Rilya never came home. There are problems with this story. Enormous, glaring problems. First, there is no record of any such DCF worker. Investigators searched every file, every database, every personnel record. No one matching Graham's description worked for DCF. No one had been assigned to evaluate Rilya. No authorization existed for any such removal. Second, Muskelly denied knowing anything about it. She denied Graham ever called her about Rilya being taken. She denied having any knowledge of a psychological evaluation. When this all came to light in 2002, Muskelly was as shocked as anyone, or at least, that's what she claimed. Third, and perhaps most damning, Graham continued to collect state payments for Rilya's care for 15 months after the child allegedly disappeared. Every month, checks arrived for Rilya's foster care. And every month, Graham cashed them. If she truly believed DCF had taken Rilya for evaluation, why was she still receiving money for the child's care? Why didn't she question it? But here's what makes this story particularly insidious. For those 15 months, nobody checked. Nobody verified. Muskie filed false reports saying she had seen Rilya and everything was fine. Graham collected money for a child who wasn't there, and the system, in all its broken glory, kept turning. In February 2001, 1 month after Rilya allegedly vanished, Graham told friends that 2 more people from DCF came to her house. They asked for Rilya's toys, said they needed them to help the child adjust to her new surroundings. Graham supposedly gave them toys, and they left. Again, no record of this visit exists. No DCF workers remember it. It never happened. There's another detail that casts doubt on Graham's timeline. A medical worker later told investigators that in February 2001, she saw Rilya at a doctor's appointment with Graham and Roderica. The worker said Rilya was there, alive, accompanying her sister to a checkup. Graham denied this. She insisted the medical worker was mistaken, that Rilya couldn't have been there because she was already gone. But the witness was certain. So what really happened in those early months of 2001? The truth is buried somewhere between Graham's lies and the system's neglect. What we know is that Rilya Wilson stopped being seen. She stopped existing in any verifiable way. And the people who should have noticed were either not looking or deliberately looking away. Months passed. January became February, became March. Spring arrived. The weather in Miami turned hot and humid, the kind of heat that makes everything feel sluggish, heavy. Inside the Graham home, Roderica remained, but Rilya was gone. Graham kept up appearances. She continued her relationship with Pamela Graham. She went about her daily life, and every month those foster care checks arrived, and Graham deposited them without hesitation. Deborah Muskelly, meanwhile, never visited the house. She called occasionally, spoke with Graham on the phone, and Graham always said the same thing. Everything's fine. The children are great. No problems. And Muskelly wrote up reports stating she had conducted in-person visits, complete with observations about the children's well-being. She even claimed travel reimbursement for miles she never drove. This went on for more than a year, 15 months, 450 days. Rilya Wilson was gone, and the world continued as if she were still there. It all came crashing down in April 2002, and it wasn't because anyone was looking for Rilya. It was because of paperwork. A DCF worker named Dora Betancourt was preparing for a routine court hearing about Roderica, Rilya's younger sister. Betancourt pulled the case files to review the children's progress. She noticed something odd. The monthly progress notes for Rilya abruptly stopped 15 months earlier. There were reports for Roderica, but nothing for Rilya. Just silence. Betancourt was bothered by this. A 15-month gap in documentation wasn't normal, even by DCF's abysmal standards. She called the Graham household that afternoon, spoke with Geraldine Graham, and asked about Rilya. Graham's response was vague, non-committal. Betancourt called again the following week. Still no clear answers. On April 18, 2002, Betancourt arranged to visit the Graham home in person. She drove to the house, pulled up to the curb. As she was getting out of her car, Geraldine Graham arrived in her own vehicle with Roderica in tow. Betancourt walked over, introduced herself. "Where's Rilya?" she asked. And Geraldine Graham said something that would become one of the most chilling lines in this entire case. "I thought you were bringing her." Think about that response. A caseworker shows up asking where a child is, and the caregiver says she thought the caseworker was bringing the child. It's nonsensical, absurd, but it's also revealing, because it shows Graham scrambling, trying to buy time, unsure what story to tell now that someone was actually asking questions. Betancourt pressed, "Where is the child? When did you last see her?" Graham then told her story about the DCF worker who took Rilya for evaluation, the woman with the accent, the promise to return the child. Graham said this happened in January 2001, 15 months ago. Betancourt's heart sank. She knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. She returned to her office, checked every database, every file. There was no record of Rilya being removed. No evaluation. No placement. Nothing. She notified her supervisors. They notified theirs. The word went up the chain. And on April 25, 2002, 7 days after Betancourt's visit, the Miami-Dade Police Department was finally notified that Rilya Wilson was missing. 7 days. A child had been missing for 15 months, and when someone finally figured it out, it took another week before law enforcement was informed. Even in the moment of discovery, the system moved with agonizing slowness. But here's what's crucial to understand. Dora Betancourt didn't show up at that house because anyone was worried about Rilya. She showed up because of an administrative hearing about a different child. If it weren't for that hearing, if Betancourt hadn't needed to pull those files, it's possible no one would have noticed for even longer. Rilya could have been missing for 2 years, 3 years, and the machinery would have kept grinding. The false reports would have kept flowing. When Betancourt asked Geraldine Graham if she was shocked that Rilya was missing, she later testified about Graham's response. "Not in the way a grandmother would be if a child was missing," Betancourt said. "There was no panic, no tears, no desperation, just a kind of detached confusion, as if they were discussing a misplaced file rather than a missing child." The moment the police were notified, the case exploded into the public consciousness. Local news picked it up immediately. A 4-year-old foster child missing for more than a year, and the state had no idea. It was a scandal of such magnitude that it couldn't be buried or minimized. Miami-Dade police launched a homicide investigation almost immediately. They had no body, no crime scene, no witnesses. But they understood what the timeline suggested. A child doesn't vanish for 15 months and turn up alive. Detectives descended on the Graham home. They searched every room, every closet, every corner. They treated the house with luminol, a chemical that reveals hidden traces of blood. They dug up the backyard, looking for any sign that Rilya had been buried there. They found nothing. No blood, no remains, no physical evidence of violence. As Detective Sarah Times later testified, "I found absolutely nothing." Police interviewed neighbors, friends, anyone who had contact with the Graham household. They put together a timeline of sightings. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing Rilya through late 2000, but after Christmas of that year, the sightings stopped. The last confirmed independent sighting of Rilya Wilson alive was sometime around the end of December 2000, or possibly early January 2001. After that, only Graham's word placed her anywhere. Investigators also began scrutinizing Deborah Miskelly. Her falsified reports were undeniable. She admitted to making phone calls instead of visits. She admitted to guesstimating mileage for reimbursement. She admitted she stopped visiting the Graham home after January 2001, but continued filing reports saying she had seen Rilya and the child was fine. In March 2002, Miskelly resigned from DCF. She faced 41 criminal charges including grand theft and official misconduct. Eventually, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of official misconduct and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. The remaining charges were dropped. She never faced charges directly related to Rilya's disappearance, though her actions created the conditions that allowed it to go undetected. At trial, Miskelly expressed regret. She said she wished she could go back and change things, but the damage was done. Her negligence had created a window of invisibility, 15 months where anything could happen to Rilya, and no one would know. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines screamed about systemic failure. Reporters dug into DCF records and discovered that Rilya wasn't alone. Thousands of children in Florida's foster care system hadn't been properly monitored. Some hadn't been seen in months. DCF had lost track of more than 1,000 kids. Governor Jeb Bush ordered a sweeping review of DCF operations. A blue ribbon panel was convened to investigate what went wrong. The findings were damning. Caseworkers were overwhelmed. Record keeping was abysmal. There was no accountability, no verification, no oversight. Children were being moved between placements without proper documentation. Some files were so incomplete it was impossible to know where certain kids even were. Kathleen Kearney, the secretary of the Florida Department of Children and Families, resigned on May 27, 2002, under enormous pressure. Her resignation was a symbol, a public acknowledgement that the agency had failed catastrophically. The case became a rallying cry for reform. Politicians promised change. Advocacy groups demanded action. The public was outraged. How could this happen? How could a child disappear and no one notice? But outrage doesn't bring back a missing child. And as the investigation continued, the focus shifted from systemic failure to a simpler question: what did Geraldine Graham do to Rilya Wilson? Police put Graham under surveillance. They went through her garbage. They monitored her movements. They hoped she would lead them to Rilya's body, or slip up and reveal something incriminating. Graham said nothing. She maintained her story. A DCF worker took Rilya, and she never saw the child again. In August 2004, more than 3 years after Rilya disappeared, Graham was arrested and charged with kidnapping and 3 counts of child abuse. The kidnapping charge stemmed from her failure to report Rilya's disappearance and her continued collection of foster care payments. The child abuse charges were based on testimony from witnesses about how Rilya had been treated while in Graham's care. Pamela Kendrick, Rilya's former caregiver, testified that both she and Geraldine Graham had beaten Rilya with switches. She said they locked the child in a dog cage. She said Rilya spent long periods confined to a small laundry room as punishment. Other witnesses corroborated this, describing a pattern of escalating abuse. Pamela Graham, Geraldine's partner, eventually broke her silence and cooperated with prosecutors. She admitted that Geraldine regularly tied Rilya to her bed at night, using plastic restraints to prevent the child from getting up. She described Rilya as being treated with cruelty and contempt. But Pamela insisted she didn't know what happened to Rilya, didn't know where the child's body was. The physical evidence of abuse was chilling. A dog cage, used to confine a 4-year-old. Flex cuffs, used to tie her to a bed. Witnesses describing a child covered in bruises and scratches. Rilya wasn't just neglected. She was actively harmed, repeatedly, by the people who were supposed to care for her. Then came the jailhouse confessions. In March 2005, Graham was indicted on first-degree murder charges after multiple inmates came forward claiming Graham had confessed to killing Rilya. The key witness was a woman named Robin Lunsford, a career criminal serving time for armed robbery. Lunsford testified that she and Graham were placed together in a holding cell on August 18, 2004, while being transported to a bond hearing. During that time, Lunsford said, "Graham confessed." She whispered it. Lunsford testified, speaking in a low voice as if she couldn't bear to say it loudly. According to Lunsford, Graham said she had walked up to Rilya and smothered her with a pillow. Graham allegedly said the child was evil, that she was plagued by demons from previous abuse, and that her mental problems would never be cured. Graham reportedly told Lunsford she gave Rilya a proper burial near water, in a place Pamela used to go fishing. The water, Graham supposedly said, represented peace and would cleanse the child's soul. Lunsford said she took notes of the conversation. She read parts of those notes to the jury. She wants them to find the grave so it can be over. It's eating her up inside. 2 other inmates also came forward, claiming Graham made similar admissions to them. One said Graham told her she killed Rilya to protect Pamela Graham. Another said Graham provided details about the burial site. But there was a problem with these confessions. They came from criminals hoping for reduced sentences. Lunsford's life sentence for armed robbery was reduced to 10 years in exchange for her testimony. The other informants also received favorable plea deals. Their credibility was immediately attacked by defense attorneys, who argued they had every incentive to lie. Defense attorney Scott Sakin hammered this point during cross-examination. He noted inconsistencies in Lunsford's testimony. At one point, she said Graham buried Rilya close to water to cleanse the soul. But in a previous interview, she had said Graham buried the child near a lake. Were those the same thing? Was Lunsford embellishing, making details up? Another inmate, Ramona Tavia, claimed she and Graham had shared a cell in November 2003 when Graham confessed. But jail records showed they had never been housed together during that time. The defense argued Tavia was lying, inventing a confession that never happened. Prosecutors countered that the records weren't always accurate, that temporary cell assignments might not be logged. Then there was Cindy McLeod, another inmate who testified that Robin Lunsford had told her the entire confession was fabricated. McLeod claimed Lunsford admitted, "It's all lies. All of it." This testimony threatened to unravel the prosecution's case entirely, but Lunsford stuck to her story. She testified for 4 days, describing the conversation in detail, insisting she was telling the truth. She acknowledged her criminal past, but said she was testifying for Rilya, not for herself. "I'll stand up loud and produce for Rilya Wilson no matter what I go through," she said tearfully. The prosecution built a circumstantial case around the jailhouse confessions. They argued that the pattern of abuse, the false story about the DCF worker, the continued cashing of checks, and the confessions all pointed to one conclusion. Geraldine Graham killed Rilya Wilson and disposed of her body in a way that ensured she would never be found. The defense offered an alternative theory. Rilya was alive. Maybe she had been sold. Maybe she was living somewhere under a different name. Maybe the whole DCF worker story was true, and some rogue element within the system had taken the child. Without a body, the defense argued, there was no proof of murder, just speculation and the word of unreliable jailhouse informants. In November 2012, more than 11 years after Rilya disappeared, Geraldine Graham's trial began in a Miami-Dade courtroom. She faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated child abuse. If convicted of murder, she faced life in prison. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Prosecutors called dozens of witnesses. Deborah Muskelly testified about her failures. Dora Betancourt described discovering Rilya was missing. Witnesses detailed the abuse Rilya endured. The jailhouse informants told their stories of Graham's confessions. Pamela Graham testified about the cruelty she witnessed. During Pamela's testimony, Geraldine had an outburst. "Stop lying, Pam," she shouted in court. "Tell them what happened. Tell them the truth." She accused Pamela of being the last one to hold Rilya, implying Pamela knew more than she was saying. The judge threatened to remove Geraldine from the courtroom if she interrupted again. The defense tried to shift blame. They emphasized DCF's failures, arguing that Rilya was a poster child for neglect by the state, not abuse by Graham. They attacked the credibility of every prosecution witness. They highlighted the lack of physical evidence, the absence of a body, the possibility that Rilya might still be alive. In January 2013, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for more than 2 days. The waiting was agonizing for everyone involved. Congresswoman Rilya Wilson, who had championed reforms in Rilya's name, attended the trial and waited for the verdict. She told reporters, "I cannot understand how a little baby girl, 4 years old, can just vanish from the face of the earth, and no one has any answers." When the jury returned, they had reached a verdict on some charges, but not all. They found Geraldine Graham guilty of kidnapping and 2 counts of aggravated child abuse. The evidence of abuse was overwhelming, and the jurors agreed Graham had harmed Rilya and failed to report her disappearance. But on the first-degree murder charge, they deadlocked. 11 jurors believed Graham was guilty. 1 holdout refused to convict. The jury split 1-1 to 1, unable to reach unanimity. The judge declared a mistrial on the murder count. 3 jurors wept as the verdict was read. Graham showed no emotion. On February 12, 2013, Graham was sentenced. She stood before the court for the first time during the entire proceeding and addressed the judge. "Rilya is a very special child to me, and I would never knowingly hurt her in any way," Graham said. "I miss her and love her deeply. It hurt me to the depth of my soul to hear that anyone could think I would do that to any child." Judge Marissa Tinkler Mendez wasn't moved. "For you, Miss Graham, the jury has spoken," she said. "You have been found to be the person responsible for the senseless, cruel, and inhumane acts directed toward this innocent, defenseless child. You are responsible for inflicting unimaginable pain and instilling fear in this child, and for repeatedly abusing this child. One can only be inherently evil to inflict this type of pain and torment on a child. Rilya Wilson deserved nothing less than a loving and nurturing environment. Instead, she lived in fear in a house of torture, fear, and abuse.